He has more than 275 peer-reviewed publications and a long history of externally funded projects, including the current NIH funding and also, again, funding he received from CBHI to utilize digital biomarkers in persons at risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. That's the work that he'll be presenting today. He's frequently asked to present his research. He's done invited lectures at NIH, New York Academy of Sciences, and Department of Health and Human Services. But most impressive, and this is something I didn't know about him before he included me in before to introduce him, that his research was featured on World News Tonight with Diane Sawyer.
Oh my God.
Boy, that's something.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Rhoda, for clapping for him. Anyway, listen, all that is wonderful. That's great stuff. But I have to tell you that John is also, he's also something that unfortunately is not as common as we'd like to see in science, and that is he's an individual of exceptional generosity, unselfishness, and kindness. He's really a remarkable human being in terms of his character, and he is a wonderful colleague. I'm one of the true joys of my job here and being at Kent State is having him as a colleague to interact with on a daily basis. So with that, unless I can embarrass him anymore, I'll turn it over to John and let him tell you about his work.
Well, thank you for that. And again, thank you to all of you for taking time out of a busy day during a very busy month for everyone. I'm really, really excited to have the chance to kind of share some of this work and really just, to some extent too, kind of bounce some of these ideas off all of you and see what you guys think as well. I'm a little bit biased, but at this point, I think having the chance to be able to look at digital biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease, especially focusing on speech, is pretty interesting. So my goal by the end of today is to hopefully brainwash all of you into thinking the same. As we dive in, an important piece of all this is really maybe just kind of a disclaimer. So a lot of this work is very much in its early stages, both in our lab and other labs around the country and really around the world. So when we kind of go into this, there's going to be a lot of spots that are going to feel more like they're ideas and methods rather than just long lists of results. And that's just kind of the state of where the field is. So I'm really just going to ask us more than anything. So please be gentle in the kind of the way that you approach these things. And we'll be able to kind of muddle through together and hopefully come up with something a little bit interesting on the other end. So let's dive in and really just kind of start really kind of at the beginning for all these things with this general premise of kind of what digital biomarkers really are. So the basic idea behind digital biomarkers is really pretty straightforward. It's just using technology to find a way to both monitor and promote health in almost any capacity. And human beings have been thinking about this for a long, long time, both in terms of a clinical sense, but even in terms of things like science fiction. So for those Star Trek fans out there, this is something that you might be kind of familiar to you. The basic premise behind this on the TV show was you could just scan an individual and identify whatever rare space disease an individual might have and identify the correct course of treatment. And clearly, we're not there yet, but it's the whole possibility that there's been kind of an explosion in the last few years of being able to use these digital markers in novel and very exciting ways that we might be able to capitalize on for those of us who are interested in neurological conditions. And part of the reason for this enthusiasm and for this excitement is kind of a movement just in general in kind of pop culture toward this notion of the quantified self. And the basic idea behind the quantified self is really just a relatively straightforward premise that individuals can improve their own well-being and kind of improve their own life by better monitoring it. And this idea of that self-knowledge through self-tracking. And there's a lot of consumer products that have followed this. So probably many of us carry around a smartphone that has a pedometer built into it. A lot of times people will track their calories through kind of apps on their phone. In terms of things like physical activity, there's heart rate monitors that are very easy to use. Many people maybe carry a Fitbit. If anybody's coming over from the Cleveland Clinic, for a while, they were asking people to wear a Pebble, which would actually kind of another form of device that would monitor things like physical activity. So it's just this basic premise that by quantifying what's going on, by tracking ourselves, we might be able to live a healthier life or be kind of more fulfilled or more satisfied as a result. But what's a little bit interesting in terms of the clinical side is this large influx of consumer-based products has then really led to dramatic advances in both in terms of sensors and in terms of computing power. And these are things that we're going to then be able to leverage as clinicians and clinical researchers to be able to use these for kind of a wide variety of other purposes. So let's talk a little bit about sensors first. So this is the area that's seen dramatic changes even in the last 2 to 3 years, where sensors are dramatically thinner, more reliable, just kind of much, much smaller than they were before. So this image on the right that's borrowed from a recent publication shows just a very, very small subset of the possible ways that digital biomarkers or digital sensors are currently being used. And it ranges from things that we might imagine. So you can put an insert into a person's shoe to be able to monitor things like gait or running speed. It includes things like rings that we'll talk about more in just a minute. There's actually things like smart clothing, but there's actually even kind of more exciting things that you can ingest. There's tattoos that are now exist. The one that just came out, and I didn't have a chance to include it into the presentation for today, but it's a permanent tattoo that actually measures blood glucose through the skin. That an individual basically just holds their smartphone up to it, and it's to be able to kind of provide an accurate and a kind of an accurate reading. So this field is advancing very, very rapidly, and as that technology advances, then we'll be able to port these into neurological populations as well. So in addition to looking at the advances in sensors, in terms of computing, essentially all of us that carry a smartphone around are really carrying the equivalent of a supercomputer in our pocket. The fact that I like to bring out every time I talk about this is, if you look at even the iPhone 6, which is relatively out of date, it's 120 million times faster than the guidance system that was on Apollo 11 that made it to the moon. And again, a lot of us are just playing Candy Crush in between meetings when we're using it for this purpose. And so this combination of these high-end sensors and this substantial computing power allows us the chance to be able to kind of look at new and novel targets that we couldn't in the past. So the idea is, can we combine these? Can we leverage these in some novel and new way? So as we start talking about digital biomarkers, there's kind of two broad categories, and it's important for us to mention both because they're going to come up a little bit later today as well. So the idea of active digital biomarkers are things that require an individual, whether they're a patient or a research participant, to do something that's deliberate and conscious to share information with us. So a classic example here from a neuropsychiatric study is we ask an individual to report their symptoms on a regular basis. So for those individuals, they would kind of click how depressed do they feel, how anxious do they feel, how impulsive, do they have any sleep troubles, be able to kind of gather that sort of information. So that's an active digital biomarker, and the person has to do something to make that happen. But there's also a growing interest in these passive digital biomarkers that are just automatically logged and recorded by the sensor and by the computer or by the smartphone that's based behind it. And this includes things like GPS, can include things like accelerometers, call or text logs. It can include timestamps. It can include, again, kind of a whole host of other things. So again, in terms of a passive digital biomarker, again, a lot of us have phones that have a pedometer built into it or a step count during the course of the day. We don't actively have to do anything. That information is simply being recorded. So one of the primary goals in digital biomarker research is to be able to leverage these things that are known and reliable markers of something. And then we look to see, can they reliably predict the things that we are most interested in? So in a way, it's a bit of kind of hunting and gathering this type of information, this type of data to see if there's something that we can do that's bigger and greater than recording step count or just gathering a person's information. So a good place to start for those people who are a little bit kind of newer to this area is just to show off some technology. So I should say I don't get a cut from any of these places, though I wish I did, or at least if they'd send me some free samples, that'd be great too. Probably the most famous digital biomarkers are really being driven by Apple Watch at this point. The two that are kind of most famous, and you guys may have seen in the news or had even patients or research participants talk about, is the FDA level ECG. So this is, again, equivalent through the watch itself. You can identify things like AFib or an arrhythmia and other forms that's at the same level as something that you would receive in a clinician's office, which, again, is just fairly remarkable to be able to do that through a wrist-worn device. Another one I think that's even a little bit more exciting because it combines multiple features is the accelerometers that are built in that identifies when a person has fallen or when it suspects that an individual has fallen. So again, for a lot of older adults who are concerned, if a person takes a tumble or the watch believes that they do, this screen will then pop up on the right-hand side and give an individual three options. Do they need help, that they fell but things are okay, or they did not fall? So if they click on that emergency SOS button, that'll automatically contact the 911 and the rescue services. But because of the built-in GPS, it will also send them a signal to where that person specifically is. So if they're away from home or unable to speak or just have difficulties providing that type of information, rescue service can still find them where they ultimately are. Which again is just fairly remarkable. For those people who are concerned, this SOS feature also has a built-in, if you don't respond after the first 2 minutes, it'll automatically send rescue to your door too, to be able to kind of come and find you to check you out to make sure that everything's okay. Another device that you guys may have seen is something called the Oura Ring. So again, this got a lot of press for those individuals who are sports fans. This was given out to the NBA and other sports leagues that played in a bubble for a period of time. The Aura was originally developed for sleep tracking. It actually does a very, very nice job of that. It's not quite as good as PSG, but it does a nice job of being able to do these. But what's particularly interesting is that the sensors are so reliable for a lot of its other features that it's now being used for other purposes. So being that we're kind of still living in the age of the pandemic, a kind of a recent study was able to find that they could identify those individuals who were developing kind of the earliest stages of COVID-19 a couple days in advance of their positive tests. So they found that changes in their temperature, so their body temperature was slightly going up, even if the individual didn't identify it or report it. There were changes in heart rate and heart rate variability, and respiratory rate changed, but particularly respiratory rate during sleep, when an individual would be unable to report that information to their physician anyway. So again, it's just this general notion of being able to take information from a reliable sensor and combine it in new and novel ways. Another thing that we don't typically think of as a digital biomarker, but has a wealth of data that we can use, is something like Facebook or other forms of social media. So in this project, what researchers did is they looked to see, could they identify those individuals with and without depression? And they found that using information from their Facebook posts was just as equivalent as using some type of self-report screening instrument for depressive symptoms. And what's a little bit interesting, this is really kind of a combination of two sets of features. So the language that people would use on Facebook. So if they're saying things like sad, depression, alone, hurt, those were very clearly strong predictors. But if you look at the other pieces at these kind of more passive digital biomarkers, so how long that an individual, like how frequently would they post? Were they posting in the middle of the night rather than the middle of the afternoon? That combination of data of post length, demographics, and temporal patterns were roughly equivalent to the language itself. So they didn't necessarily have to ask an individual if they were depressed to know it. They could just tell based on these diurnal, these chronobiological rhythms. So these are, again, just a very, very small subset of the rapidly increasing number of digital biomarkers that have been collected through kind of consumer-based products. But we also know that digital biomarkers have a long and very successful history in clinical settings already. So one common one, and the one that's probably kind of has paved the way for a lot of others, is this basic premise behind Holter monitors. Something that I didn't really know until somewhat recently. The first Holter monitor was actually developed in 1953, and it was kind of the prototypes were first started being used in clinical settings in 1957. So again, this has been around for more than a half century, that being able to kind of gather this type of data. We have an equally long history, or nearly as long history, in neurological disorders, with something like ambulatory EEG, again, perhaps being kind of most commonly used. So again, this was developed more than 4 decades ago. And even back in 1979, when this was first hit the market, they even recognized then that a 4-channel EEG isn't provide the same density of information, doesn't provide the same clinical information as we can receive during a clinical visit, but it does provide something that's new and unique and complements what we can do in the clinic. And again, this is another calling card or another important aspect of digital biomarkers, that it's not meant to be a substitute for those clinical markers. It's really meant to supplement and provide something that's new and novel. So in the case of something like ambulatory EEG, a person might wear that for 72 hours rather than a 1-hour office visit. And we might be able to detect something that's new or novel or different and provide an important clue to what's going on for that given individual. Other forms of digital biomarkers that are being used in neurological populations, Parkinson's disease has received a dramatic attention, has probably the longest history in terms of kind of the research side, particularly with things on the left where they use actuators to look for things like tremor, where they can specifically kind of titrate the degree of tremor, particularly before and after a DBS procedure. These things are effective, but they're a little bit clunky. Asking an individual to wire up their fingers to be able to kind of connect this to a device becomes a little bit problematic for a lot of individuals, especially if they have motor concerns. So a little more recent or kind of updated version is seen on the right, where this is an armband that measures not just tremor, but also can measure things like motor impersistence or other types of motor abnormalities that happens in a person's upper extremities. The more recent, kind of slightly more commercial version of this actually looks a little bit better as well. So you would see it on an individual and not necessarily think that it's going to be a medical device. But again, this provides information we couldn't get from a clinical setting, because a person can wear this at home, they can wear this in real world settings, and then report back on their symptoms. We can correlate and kind of correspond those information to be able to provide new forms of treatment, or at least identify a potential concern for that given individual. More recently, people started to move into stroke, and this is something that's a little bit interesting, just that this is an instrumented walkway. So you can kind of see in the image here that there's a number of kind of small little boxes. This is a very complex array of digital sensors that are built into the person's walking to be able to calculate, in this case, gait symmetry, or kind of abnormal gait following a stroke. And why this is important is what we know in many clinical settings. As a clinician, we can recognize when gait is abnormal relatively quickly. We can do this in the research world as well. But in many situations, all we have to quantify that abnormal gait or the gait asymmetry is a rating scale. So we simply say that it's mild or moderate or severe. This allows us to be able to provide a much more fine-grained analysis in terms of quantification or in terms of diagnosis. But more important, it allows us then to be able to monitor a person's progress over the course of time in a way that's much more sophisticated, or more importantly, for a lot of people who do things like physical therapy or occupational therapy after stroke procedures, this fine-grained analysis of motor performance then allows in the identification of new and novel targets. So we might be able to identify kind of a new area of weakness or a new area of strength that's a new area for us to be able to kind of work for it going forward. So that's kind of a quick tour of digital biomarkers in the market and things that have been done kind of in clinical settings so far. So given all this initial and early success, it's not surprising that people are starting to focus on Alzheimer's disease as well. So these are a couple, just kind of a handful of the markers stolen from one recent review saying, here are things that might be potentially valuable to look at in terms of Alzheimer's disease. And it runs the gamut for a lot of these sensors that we've already talked about. So using the microphone or the touchscreen, the camera, cardiac function, movement, day-night alterations, light sensors, and a whole host of other things as well. So again, there's many possible ways for us to be able to gather that information and use it in kind of new and novel ways. For me, and here comes the hard sell for the rest of the time here today, my goal is to persuade you that we might be wanting to look at speech as a particularly valuable marker for a couple different reasons. So I'm going to focus on kind of speech analysis for a couple different reasons. And I think some of them are a little bit practical and some of them tend to be a little bit more scientific and conceptual. So we first started getting into speech analysis with the basic premise that this is something that's super easy to collect. So it's not a blood marker, it's not a PET scan. Again, individuals talk on a daily basis. This information is also very easy to gather. Again, with individuals having smartphones or digital technologies everywhere, collecting a person's speech is relatively easy to do. And even just a consumer grade product provides enough adequacy and enough density of that recording for us to be able to do complex analysis on it. So this is something that's cheap and easy to use. But the other part, and why I think this is an advantage over a lot of other digital biomarkers, is there's a long history that knowing that speech is impaired in persons with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So again, for those of us who work in the research world in this population or in clinical settings, we know that things like confrontation naming, so the Boston naming test, or semantic fluency, like animal naming, are oftentimes kind of early hallmarks of changes in persons who are at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so knowing that there's this very, very kind of strong base that language deficits occur and it's cheap and easy to use, it makes sense that we should pursue this as a potential target. But what's particularly exciting is there's a growing number of research that really identifies that spontaneous speech, something sometimes called discourse or narrative language, just a person talking kind of off the top of their head or talking during conversation, might be more sensitive to early stages of Alzheimer's disease than confrontation or semantic fluency. And in a way, this makes perfect sense. We imagine that speech is a complex process that involves combination of memory and working memory and executive functioning. It's problem solving, it's planning. It's all of these things all bundled up into one. And so when we work with these individuals, for those of us who do Alzheimer's disease research, we again oftentimes refer to something as this idea of empty or hollow speech, that a person's speech is just loose, it's imprecise, it's not specific, where they will refer to that thing rather than the armchair, or that thing rather than the coffee cup. And we can talk about that and we sense it and we have the gut feeling for it, but being able to quantify it during clinical settings can be a little bit more challenging. And that's really where these digital biomarkers have kind of exploded and I think have significant potential for research going forward. So a little bit of homework. So I apologize. This slide is super, super dense, but it'll kind of set up a couple of the things that we're going to talk a little bit later on. When we start thinking about language, obviously, I'm no language expert. I was really hoping our kind of psycholinguist could be on the call today, but unfortunately, that wasn't going to work out for her schedule. So I will muddle through this and pretend like I know what I'm talking about. But when we're looking at speech in a kind of a very, very broad sort of way, we're going to identify that it happens at 4 levels. There's phonetic or phonological speech. This happens at the sound level. So this is phonemes. Again, things, if you think back to phonics class, for those of us who are a little bit older, this is word articulation. This is starting and stopping of speech. The next level up is lexical semantic speech. This is the content of words. So these are which specific words an individual is using. We have morphosyntactic level of speech. This is at the sentence level. So do the items tie together? Does it have a noun and a verb? Are those in the correct tense? Is there noun-verb agreement? And then the last level is the discourse or the pragmatic. And this is really more at the paragraph or the idea level. Just, is the person communicating an appropriate idea? Are they being able to get their message across? Can they communicate what their concerns or their needs may potentially be? So in research to date, what we know is that in terms of Alzheimer's disease, there's impairments in all of these levels. And all of these levels of language are kind of at the linguistic level. And the vast majority of time so far has really been focusing on this lexical semantic speech. And the primary reason for that has, again, been twofold. Number one is, again, we know these things are impaired in persons with Alzheimer's disease, so it became a bit of an easy target. But until very recently, it was also difficult to do a lot of this other work for reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So a substantial amount of work is, again, really focused on lexical semantic aspects of speech. Which word is a person using, and does an individual's hollow speech or kind of lack of precision, lack of specificity start to be an early identifier, an early marker of AD. So in figuring out kind of how we do this, most often in, again, kind of a lot of research or even in clinical settings, if we need to generate a speech sample, what we're looking for is an individual to produce about 60 to 90 seconds of uninterrupted speech. So we want to be able to kind of turn them loose, get them started, and just be able to have them kind of talk for a period of time and then analyze that information. So this is a very, very common measure. Some of you may have known it too. They violated copyright on this when they put it in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. So I don't feel quite as bad putting it as part of my talk here today. This is something called the cookie theft picture. So if I was administering this as part of a protocol, whether it's a research or in the clinic, I would show this to an individual and say, I'd like for you to tell me what you see here. And at that point, we just get out of the person's way and let them talk. And we'd have them go around the picture and provide a substantial amount of information of what's going on. And hopefully they'd be able to kind of pick out a large number of details. But what we also know is that there's other ways to be able to generate speech that are standardized. A common one that we're going to talk about in a little bit is we want individuals to generate protocol speech. And this is where we tell them a task, and their job is to tell us the steps that are necessary to complete that task. The two that are most commonly used in the literature, one is tell me how you take out cash from an ATM. Or the one that I think is a little bit more fun is we ask an individual, so imagine that you're sitting where you are, tell me how you would go and make a peanut butter sandwich in your own kitchen. And what we want individuals to do in that case is to walk through step by step of all the elements that they need. So that, again, taps into memory and organization and problem solving kind of all at once while they're still speaking off the top of their head. And what we know is these sorts of tasks, whether it's telling them to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or talking about that picture or the whole host of others, is very strongly related to Alzheimer's disease and does a nice job of discriminating people with and without impairment. So again, this is a handful of things. We'll talk about these findings a little bit more specifically over the next couple of slides. The long and the short of it is we can identify speech changes very early in the process of Alzheimer's disease, with particularly things that are called lexical fluency or lexical diversity. This is really a strong and broad-based marker of specificity of speech. So when we talk about lexical specificity, kind of an easy example for that is the difference between an animal versus a dog versus a German Shepherd. That more sophisticated speech, that more precise speech, in many instances is ultimately what we're looking for. Because as an individual progresses into Alzheimer's disease from MCI, what we know is that speech becomes less specific. So they may say, I have a German Shepherd, to I have a dog, to I have an animal, or I have a pet in my home. So speech shifts toward things that are more common, higher frequency words, because those more specific instances or exemplars are more difficult to be able to kind of pull out of their memory. This type of speech, lexical fluency and other ones, again, does a nice job of being able to distinguish between kind of 80 and 90% of individuals, even in the absence of other types of information. So something about the words that individuals are choosing does a very nice job of identifying between AD and controls kind of across the board. And talking more specifically about what these changes ultimately look like, again, here's kind of a long list of what we see during kind of the earliest stages of kind of moving from intact into MCI and then into early Alzheimer's disease. Again, this is just reduced semantic specificity. So using vague words, empty words, high frequency words, so things that are kind of more common rather than more specific. We know that an individual is going to have kind of a lower idea density, which is that there's just less there. That they have a difficult time communicating what they're being able to do. So it involves oftentimes people will start using more gestures. They're going to start using fewer content words. So there's going to be kind of less ideas or kind of fewer ideas being kind of driven into their speech. As the disease then progresses and moves from kind of early AD into moderate or later stages, we know that other aspects of speech then start to deteriorate as well. So loss of articulation, loss of phonetic retrieval. So the person's not just articulation becomes impaired because of the motor control, but they're producing the wrong sounds, or sentences no longer kind of match in the way that they're supposed to, whether with noun-verb agreement or other aspects of the kind of those morphosyntactic aspects of speech. And so the question you might be asking, if we already know all of this, what's new? So why is this interesting? Why is BHRI and CBHI providing some funding for this? And the long and the short of it is that technology has kind of caught up to our ideas, or starting to catch up to what our ideas may potentially be. Because historically, doing speech analysis was incredibly time intensive, incredibly burdensome. We would have to manually transcribe somebody's speech, manually code everything that we wanted to. So whether it's nouns or verbs or kind of higher order pieces, and then we'd eventually have to, by hand, analyze all these speech features as well. This was incredibly labor intensive. For a long period of time, large studies in this area would typically be 25 to 30 to 40 individuals, just because that process would take tens of hours per study participant. Because of technology, including some that's being driven by our collaborator at IBM, who's actually kind of writing some of the code to make some of these things happen, this is much, much faster than it ever was before. And this happens in two separate ways. So number one is just speech recognition. So we've all used dictation software, whether good or bad. This technology gets better all the time. The kind of the IBM recognition technology is now up to around 95% accurate, and that's getting better all the time. So that just reduces that need to be able to kind of transcribe everything by hand. The other piece that's been kind of an advantage is the idea of kind of natural language processing, where once we have a transcription, we can go back in and rather having to count things by hand and produce all these very complicated calculations, we're now simply just be able to kind of generate hundreds, if not thousands of indices based on that individual speech, based on their word choices from the transcription itself. So we've kind of cut out those middle steps of all the labor intensive pieces, and we can just jump to the good stuff at the end. So with that in mind, let's jump into some of the work that we've been doing and kind of some of the early findings that we have so far. So in our first project, we were really just trying to look for proof of concept. And the basic premise was behind this is using kind of this new technology, using things like this new speech recognition and this natural language processing. Is there a signal? Is there really enough here to dedicate time and energy and resources over the next couple of years to want to be able to kind of pursue this line of research? So once again, we're focusing exclusively on lexical semantic aspects of speech. So this is just the content of word choices. So we recruited a group of older adults. We had them do neuropsychological testing and speech samples at baseline. Then we brought them back 12 months later, had them kind of just repeat that process. And what we found is just that short speech sample, just that 60 to 90 seconds at baseline, did a very, very nice job shown in figure A of predicting speech, predicting cognitive function at baseline as measured by the modified Minty-Mental Status Exam, or the 3MS. So we found there's a very, very high correspondence between the person's speech content and their performance on that test. But what was surprising was the strong correlation, and this is shown in kind of figure B, the ability of baseline speech to predict cognitive function 12 months later. So again, we can see that regression line is very, very strong, kind of smack dab down the middle for these individuals. Speech at baseline also predicted those handful of individuals that showed a decline from visit 1 to visit 2, arguing that there is a kind of a very strong signal here. And again, it's being driven primarily by this idea of lexical frequency. It's this marker of precision of speech and kind of the sophistication. So using German Shepherd or dog rather than animal were kind of the best predictors. And we dig a little bit deeper, we can kind of potentially learn a little bit more about this too. So this is the part that really, for me, solidified that there's some value here. And this is something that worth spending a little bit of time and energy on. So first up, using this large red box across the middle of the screen, we see that different speech indices were kind of strongly related to different kind of commonly administered neuropsychological tests. But in particular, the Hopkins verbal learning test, so a very common test of a kind of a list learning task and delayed recall were most strongly associated with speech. So for in this sample with very, again, kind of minimal neurological disorders, what this is really kind of arguing is that if we imagine the HVLT is somewhat sensitive to the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, we seem to be tapping into something that we might be of interest, that might be kind of a focus for us later on. In the yellow box under lexical frequency, we can also see that how lexical frequency, again, this measure of specificity, of precision of language, it was very strongly related to essentially all the neuropsychological tests, are again arguing that this might be kind of a strong marker for as just kind of a general proxy for their overall level of cognitive functioning. So again, this was very, very surprising and encouraged us to kind of continue on in this area. So in study number 2, we wanted to shift a little bit, and this is really kind of my goal for all of this, is moving from things that kind of feel stilted in a laboratory setting to something that feels a little bit closer to language, to kind of real world speech, rather than something that would be done in a laboratory. And the primary kind of end goal for something like that is showing a person that picture of kind of the cookie theft or asking them to make a peanut butter sandwich. that's okay. But if we can just kind of pull something out of a natural conversation, that's going to be more beneficial in the long run to a larger number of individuals. So in this case, we used another validated speech task, which is something called the Cinderella test. For this task, what we do is we have an individual flip through a picture book of the story of Cinderella after we've taken all the words out. At that point, what we do is we then close the book and take it away from them and ask them to retell us the story from beginning to end. So that's what we now have as our speech sample there. So they're telling us the story of Cinderella according to the kind of the Disney version. And in this case, what we wanted to know is, could we identify those individuals not just corresponding to cognitive functioning, because it's possible that people could all be intact and still show a relationship, but did this have some clinical value? So we wanted to know, could this speech content, these lexical semantics, this word level speech, identify people with and without MCI? And it could. Highlighted in the table down below, we can see that lexical semantic aspects of speech identified right around 80% in terms of kind of discriminability, whereas the 3MS, a global screener that's very commonly used in clinical settings to identify people with MCI, was a little bit worse. Or at the very least, they're equal. Our speech content is at least equal, if not maybe a little bit better than the 3MS may potentially be. So again, this is very exciting. So it's not just that we're tapping into people who are maybe slightly better or slightly worse on a task. There actually might be some clinical relevance to this type of approach as well. So this is a very busy slide, and I apologize for it too. What I'm really going to try to highlight in here too, these are all the speech indices that we use as kind of part of this project. I'm going to pull your attention just those 3 that have been starred. So we have nouns, determiners, and something called the honore statistic. In each of these, what we're really kind of looking at is the specificity and the idea density. So things like nouns and determiners are kind of how much content does an individual have. Determiners are the precision of speech. And the honor statistic is, again, just another way of being able to look at the specificity of speech. So are they saying that the individual lost her glass slipper rather than she lost her shoe? So in each of these cases, that precision of language, that specificity of language was really kind of the driving factor in identifying people with and without MCI. And again, in a convenient sample of of older adults from the community. So once again, this is all very, very exciting and argues that there's kind of significant promise in using this type of approach and being able to move it forward. But for me, I always tend to be a little bit risk averse for these sorts of things. And for those people who are psychometricians in the crowd, you might like this project in particular. That's all well and good. But the question comes up is speech reliable? And we know, particularly for persons with MCI or maybe early stage Alzheimer's disease, that individuals and their family members report that there's inconsistencies, that sometimes they're better than others. Maybe they're better in the morning, or they're better after waking up a little bit, after they kind of warm up and start the day. And so our question was, can we actually tap into that variability? But more importantly, is that variability going to throw this out so we can actually not use speech because there's not enough substance, it's not reliable or robust enough for us to be able to use it going forward? So for this project, we had a relatively small number of individuals, again, just kind of 39 individuals, but we had them provide 3 speech samples that were very, very similar in terms of context. So we had the cookie theft picture that you guys have seen before, and then we have the alternate forms of the cookie theft, where they just tell us a story about some type of cartoon image. And what we can see is that speech is robust. So if we look at the figure here on the intact slide on the left, those are individuals who are cognitively intact. MCI are people on the right. And we can see this is something called the Brunette's Index. This is, again, another measure of specificity or precision of language. And what we can see is the same individuals are indicated by kind of the pink color, the green color, and the blue color. And so a person would give each of those 3 speech samples, and we see at the means are kind of broadly normal across all 3 of these, and the variability is roughly equivalent. So again, for our purposes, what this ultimately means is that speech between individuals with and without cognitive impairment differs, arguing that there's some sensitivity, but the variability within a given individual and within a group, so persons who are intact or persons with MCI, is adequate enough for us to be able to use this as a proxy measure going forward. So on the kind of the basis of some of that work and some of the other things we're going to be talking about, again, in a few more slides, we had the opportunity to be able to work with something called the YCAP Offspring Study. So many of you might be familiar with kind of the original YCAP study, the Washington Heights Inwood Community Aging Project, which is being run in New York City. They've enrolled nearly 6,000 individuals since 1989 and have following these individuals over time. So this is a large, diverse sample of aging individuals, and they're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them in terms of their markers. So in terms of things like brain aging, they look at MRI, neuropsychological testing. Many of them have had other types of blood markers for Alzheimer's disease. They do comprehensive medical workups, psychosocial evaluations. So really, it's just a very kind of a very prominent and very well characterized sample of aging individuals who are diverse. Very recently, they've started the YCAP offspring study. So these are the adult children of individuals in that original project. And we've had the opportunity as part of an ancillary R01 that was recently funded to be able to kind of examine spontaneous speech in this offspring study. So the grand plan of this is to be able to kind of replicate everything that's going on in the original project, just in a younger group of individuals. So in terms of this sample, it's going to be roughly 60% Spanish, native Spanish speakers, 40% English, but they're going to have this detailed and rich history for medical data, neuropsychological testing, mood, daily function, detailed psychosocial history, including things like educational attainment, discrimination, racial discrimination, kind of among a host of others. Many are also going to be able to have kind of structural imaging, including advanced PET imaging as well. So the thought is by having this at the baseline, we're going to be able to kind of provide, again, hopefully some very novel insight into how spontaneous speech works in the sample. And as the YCAP offspring study was just identified for kind of follow-up study, our hope is to be able to follow these individuals over time. So not just have baseline data, but be able to follow them for the next 10 to 15 to 20 years and look to see how these speech markers might identify those people at risk for decline over time. They just recently sent us the first batch of 800 participants, which is very exciting, but 800 is a lot. So it kind of wrinkles my brain a little bit to try to figure out how we're going to be able to sort all that stuff out. But we'll come back in a couple of years and I'll give you guys an updated version of that. Okay, so at this point, if we use that as kind of a bit of a background, hopefully at this point I've persuaded you at least a little bit to think that speech might be a little bit interesting, that there might be some potential value to things like digital biomarkers, and that speech might be kind of a logical marker for potentially something like early detection of Alzheimer's disease or MCI, or at the very least being able to kind of monitor individuals over the period of time. And the grand hope behind this is we might be able to kind of target this green line here, from a very article from Fersoni, being able to identify, can we use this as an early biomarker? Can this actually be used at a community level or at a population level to be able to kind of track this information down? So the original plan for our pilot project through CBHI and BHRI was to use the everyday conversation. So what we wanted to have individuals do was simply just kind of come on in, have a conversation in addition to neuropsychological testing, have a conversation with us, with another older adult who's intact, and then an older adult with impaired cognitive functioning. And this really kind of builds on this general premise of all these things we've talked about so far, that we have kind of cheap and better technology. Speech might be kind of a good proxy measure. So this is something that a lot of times older adults are going to be doing anyway. They're going to be talking to their friends or talking to family members. Maybe we can draw something that's going to be valuable from it. So we got this project up and running. Things were going very well. We were actually ahead of recruitment schedule, about 2/3 done. And then the pandemic hit. And I suspect a lot of you will have kind of similar stories as well. At that point, we had to suspend the project and kind of discontinue it at that point because we were running a lot of our study participants in community living centers for senior citizens. And again, a lot of those facilities closed down or locked their doors to outsiders. I also certainly didn't want to bring undergraduates who may be super spreaders and kind of bring them into that type of community. So at that point, there was a thought of we can no longer kind of pursue this research, as we're simply just going to be kind of stalled at that time. But I'm always a big believer in trying to look on kind of the bright side of things and trying to find a way to be able to kind of make lemonade out of lemons. So we stepped back and started kind of thinking, well, given this is what's going on, and really what would our study tell us and what would potentially be the next step? So is it possible for us to maybe kind of leapfrog and jump 1 or 2 steps forward and actually be able to kind of continue to move our work forward? And that's ultimately what we did, kind of based on the next 2 slides. So number 1 is that older adults are much more tech savvy than we often give them credit for. So what we know is even prior to the pandemic, roughly 77% of older adults regularly would use a smartphone. And that means at least once per week, which is far higher than I think a lot of people would estimate. But we also know that during the pandemic, older adults have gotten great at things like video conferencing, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or FaceTime, whatever it may potentially be, with their friends and their family and other people that they're trying to keep in contact with. So our first thought is this is a group that's somewhat tech savvy to begin with. They become much more so during this short period of time. Can we leverage that? Can we build on that? Then we also want to be able to kind of combine that with the data of teleneuropsychology, which has been around for a while. This is just administering neuropsychological tests through video conferencing systems. And what we've known for a while is that teleneuropsychology is roughly equivalent to face-to-face testing for both individuals who are intact, so people without any cognitive difficulties, but also impaired older adults, so people with MCI or Alzheimer's disease. And so given that this is roughly equivalent, our thought is how much can we simply move to kind of a remote world and be able to kind of keep our momentum going? And it's kind of highlighted by the last bullet point down below. These are a lot of the common tasks that we are already using in our study protocol anyway. So the thought is let's just port them over and use them online instead. So if this is our kind of our second and kind of updated version, the thought is if we have a group that's now more computer savvy than they were before, and we're going to be able to use video conferencing when we couldn't before, let's not stop there. Let's just not replicate the project using different technology. Can we continue to push it even further? So very quickly, by using this type of format, we can now analyze video, which is a feature that we didn't have before. But importantly, we could also then focus on things like acoustic speech features. We can look at prosody. We can look at some of those other levels of language that we talked about kind of early before. It's not just the words that they're using. We can actually kind of look at these other things because the recordings are going to be that much stronger and that much better. And what we know is that there's already some evidence for abnormalities in acoustic speech features and motor features in persons at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So know that in terms of things like acoustic speech, there's changes in a person's prosody, the melodic or the musical quality of speech, the hesitation rate or the pause rate starts to change. There's variations in a person's loudness. So sometimes they speak louder than they should and quieter than they should other times. It's kind of a lack of precision or lack of motor control of the larynx. We know that pitch changes and vibration changes happen kind of the exact same way. So again, if we imagine that the brain in producing that complex order of speech is trying to map all those motor signals at the same time, and it's just being unable to do so because of the development of the underlying neuropathology. We can also see some motor features start to change. So it's not as significant as it is in something like Parkinson's disease or other movement types of disorders as well. But we know that there are significant changes in things like eye movements, whether it's eye blink. There is some facial masking that starts to happen relatively early on. There's some loss of specificity of facial expression. So people just have kind of less expressive features. And these things start to happen a little bit early on as well. So there's the thought that if these things are existing, maybe we can leverage them. So at this point, in conjunction with our partner from IBM, but also with another industry partner, the thought is what exists in a way where I don't have to learn to code because I don't have nearly the attention to detail to be able to do that successfully. So again, we're working with individuals who are literally developing this technology on a week-by-week basis. So this is what we can currently get. A couple of weeks from now, we'll have a lot more indices as well. But in terms of acoustic speech features, what this process actually does, it just listens to the speech for any predetermined clip that we identify. Kind of between that beginning point and that end point, it'll generate these plus a whole host of other acoustic features. So again, telling us information about vibrations in a person's voice or in their larynx. It'll talk about things like breathiness or aspiration. So this notion of hypophonia, if a person's unable to adequately support what they're saying. It'll talk about things like loudness and other things like frequency that become a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more of a challenge. But we can now do this in an automated fashion. So again, this leap forward in technology provides a substantial amount of new information for us. In addition to the acoustic features, we have the opportunity now to kind of tap into kind of a large number of motor features as well. So this is based on something called the Ekman faces. For those people who kind of remember your Gen Psych class way back long ago when they looked at facial expressions, or this has actually been highlighted in a couple of crime TV shows now too. What essentially is going on is through a person's webcam, they apply these miniature dots or these virtual dots on a person's face, and then are be able to measure frame by frame a person's movement in slightly less than a millimeter. So they're going to look to see, are facial expressions symmetrical? Does a person smile when they're happy, or do they have some type of masking? They can look for asymmetry from one side or the other. They can look at eye blink. How often does it happen? What's the duration? Are eye blinks consistent, or is there variability? They can also code things like respiration rate. Again, just by the kind of the way that a person's posture might change or how much they move around. And one of these things that's a little bit fascinating, but also a little bit creepy about all this stuff too, is through your webcam, you can actually identify a person's pulse or their heart rate just by looking at kind of the way that their skin flushes or their cheeks flush from beat to beat. So again, we can kind of track all this information as a passive digital biomarker. So the older adult is simply providing us a speech sample, and as we're able to kind of generate all this long collection of variables for it. So this turned into our pilot study 2.0, where we're doing teleneuropsychological testing using a lot of the common measures that we would use in clinical settings. We're using, once again, these spontaneous speech tasks. So we have them kind of talk in a way that's a little bit closer to the naturalistic real world. And then we have automated analyses of this long collection of, again, speech content. So these lexical and semantic features, so the word level, but then also acoustic speech, along with all these motor changes. So to provide kind of a little bit of information about this, it's important to kind of provide one kind of caveat. And this is why I had the disclaimer at the beginning. All this technology is being built as we go. We are quite literally the first people to be using it because our team is the people that are developing it. So in order for us to be able to kind of validate this, we added a kind of an additional comparison group. So we're looking now at 3 conditions. We have healthy young adults who are cognitively intact from Kent State. We have a group of cognitively intact older adults, and then we have older adults who meet diagnostic criteria for MCI. And really what we're going to be able to try to do behind all of this is kind of a mini validation step for number one, but most importantly, then be able to provide clues, because our grand goal is to be able to follow these individuals over the course of time. So at this point, we're about 2/3 of the way through. So we're going to be able to kind of highlight some of the preliminary data. So what you're seeing again is all very, very new. It's not particularly elegant in the way that it's set up, but it provides maybe at least a little bit of a taste of kind of where this is going to end up, hopefully here in the very near future. So first up, in terms of cognitive testing, the test results play out exactly the way that you might imagine, and actually the way that individuals were selected. So in terms of cognitive test performance, just raw performance, young adults are better than intact older adults, who are better than persons with MCI. And that's not surprising. That's the way that groups are characterized and they were classified for inclusion into the study. A little bit more interesting, though, is looking at the speech content features. So in this case, it's just lexical and the semantic features. And what we see is that young adults and intact older adults are equivalent, that there's not a deficit. There doesn't seem to be kind of an age-related change in some of these features, except in those individuals who meet diagnostic criteria for MCI, arguing at least there's some possibility that this might be a specific marker for some type of pathology. And we see more evidence for this as we move into some of the other features, and particularly these acoustic and motor features. When we look at things like facial asymmetry or shimmer, kind of the vibrations in a person's voice, we see a very distinct pattern that young adults and intact older adults are basically identical. They're basically equivalent on all of these. And then older adults with MCI are the kind of the abnormal group, or the group that's kind of away from all of the others. So for something like shimmer, again, we can kind of see that there's much more kind of abnormalities, or kind of much broader range. It's a lack of motor control in persons with MCI. For things like head movement, this is a little bit interesting for those people kind of wondering why there might be less head movement in a person with MCI. And the primary reason is this is attentional focus. So what ends up happening, we actually see this in persons with ADHD, but we also see this in fighter pilots as well, is when things start getting difficult, a person sits up straight and they lock in. Maybe the same way when you're driving down the road and suddenly something kind of crosses, an animal may cross the road in front of you. What ends up happening is we sit up straight and we lock our head into place. And so we can see that older adults with MCI are kind of locking in place more with my speculation is because the task is being found to be more difficult. So they're trying harder, they're exerting more effort than people who are young adults or kind of the older adults. So again, we kind of see this clear and consistent pattern. Also interesting, when we look at the correlations in just the older adults, so both with and without MCI, we see strong correlations to cognitive test performance. So in this case, we're using a story memory task, the Craft Story 21, where we tell them a story, they tell it back to us, and then after about 20 minutes go by, we have them retell that story by memory. What we can see is that these motor and speech features, again, are fairly strongly correlated to these kind of traditional neuropsychological indices. And even at first glance, some of these markers that are a little bit lower, the thought is we're not necessarily with digital biomarkers, we're not looking for one sign, we're not looking for one marker that's going to tell the difference, because we don't have to. With digital biomarkers, we can collect a very large number of markers and combine them together through a regression to be able to make that more probabilistic determination. So for something like this, in looking at immediate recall or delayed recall, based on just these 4 indices, we can do a very good job of identifying people who are intact versus impaired just on this relatively small number, when we have more than 100 left that we can kind of bring into the mix as well. So again, there's a very strong feeling like we're on the right direction. We're tapping into all of this. We just need to be able to kind of continue to push, finish up this project, then start rolling it forward. And in terms of moving this project forward and kind of where I see the field going, at least from our lab and from others as well, is kind of 3 main areas in terms of neurological research. So number one, and this is the spot that I've been focusing on, is can we make this fully automated? Can we have these analyses done in real time from truly natural conversations? So my eventual goal is a person could just download an app on their smartphone. So when a grandmother's talking to her grandchild and using FaceTime, that just running passively in the background, we could actually monitor speech, monitor these acoustic signals, monitor motor changes over the course of time, and identify when there's a change. So it's not necessarily maybe perfect at detection from a single snapshot from a cross-sectional standpoint, but following a person over time, we can identify something has now changed. The technology exists to make this happen, but the science behind it does not. And that's something that our lab and some of the labs we're collaborating with are very much kind of focusing on, is can we move that direction and make this in a way where it's a real-time app that's just simply running in the background? Number two, and here comes the sales pitch, and wondering if some of you might be interested in this type of work. Hopefully you've thought at least this is at least a little bit interesting, is should we potentially kind of consider doing this through the ADRC or potentially maybe multiple ADRCs? Digital biomarkers are cheap and easy to collect. Quite literally, we could ask patients at any site from the United States who are comfortable with Zoom to do a 15-minute session with us, and that's all the information that we would need. Based then on those digital biomarkers, we could analyze that in conjunction with the rich data sets that's being collected through the ADRC already. So neuropsychological testing, medical history, neuroimaging, all those other advanced and very rich data source that's being gathered, we could just leverage on top of that. The other potential advantage for something like that through the ADRC, we might be able to tap into identify those individuals who show greater variability or fluctuations at home to be able to provide kind of some diagnostic criteria that may potentially be valuable as well. So, for example, if a patient and their caregiver or their family member reports, they're better in the morning or they're better in the afternoons or better at home, we could test that. It'd be very easy for us to be able to kind of gather that information in a way that's cheap and easy to use and be able to kind of analyze that and look for that true level of fluctuation to help kind of tailor their treatment, or at the very least provide behavioral strategies for the patients and the family to optimize their quality of life. And then finally, kind of the last next step for this type of research as well is the logical one, is this could be extended into a whole host of other neurological populations as well. We've started focusing on Alzheimer's disease just because it's the most prevalent. It's going to cost $1 trillion for the country by 2050 for all those other reasons. But this would, again, this methodology could be very easily distributed into other patient populations with minimal effort. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and it's all very exciting. So it's just kind of a quick wrap up. Thank you, obviously, to all the kind of people on the slide, but most importantly, thank you to all of you for kind of taking part in kind of today's session. And if you guys have any questions, whether that's for the next few minutes or if you just want to be able to send me an email, I'm happy to answer anything that you might be interested in. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
We'll give him a virtual round of applause here. And as John said, we'll take questions, and I think I'll start. John, by asking you kind of two sort of tough ones here. One is clearly the ethical and privacy concerns about using biometric data in this way, particularly given, again, that we're in a time where during the pandemic, it's sort of easy to see people being more willing to do it. But as we come out of it, as you know, it's harder to go back in terms of privacy than it is to reveal things. So what's your answer to that first?
Sure. It's a legitimate concern. And really just as people move things, even like medical records online, or even, again, just the whole notion of the Internet of Things, where quite literally, if you wanted to, it's possible to hack a number of pacemakers that simply just don't have a kind of appropriate Internet experience. So this is a legitimate concern. The way that we're managing in terms of this project is simply by using things that are HIPAA compliant, that we know are secure, things that are kind of hospital grade to be able to do that. Going forward, what that's eventually going to mean for smartphones, I think at the consumer level, there's a bigger push for privacy concerns, where the whole thought is, could actually this data simply just be encrypted in a way that would keep it safe from kind of hackers or other types of information. I think the other piece that's a little bit valuable for these sorts of things is we also might be able then to distribute it. So a person having a conversation with their granddaughter, they may not necessarily think would be a worry. All this data in raw form, it also isn't particularly worrisome. So again, we're not in most situations, we're not gathering information by itself that's particularly private or worrying. But yes, it's a legitimate concern, something that we're kind of building on the back end. For now, we protect it with an informed consent. As we move to the consumer level, that's something that hopefully kind of the rest of our team will be able to jump in and make happen.
Thanks. Well, let me also then ask you about the challenge of incorporating this into minority populations. Mm-hmm. Because as you know, that really is a very significant challenge for Alzheimer's disease research and dementia research in general. And I can imagine the attitudes would be different, that access to technology would be different. What have you thought? What are your thoughts on that?
Our hope is actually this might be a benefit for kind of a couple of other reasons that are along with that as well. So we know, for example, African Americans are less likely to talk to their physicians if they're worried about things like memory loss or Alzheimer's disease. And so our thought is if we'd have something that could be done at home independently, that might be able to kind of allow those individuals to kind of start that conversation or identify something, even if they're uncomfortable talking to their doctor about it. Maybe a family member might put that app on their phone or kind of be able to identify this in some other way. But the other nice thing about smartphone technology is, again, we know that there are racial differences or ethnic differences in access to this type of technology, but it's become cheaper all the time. And it's certainly cheaper than having kind of high level insurance for many individuals who would be able to go in and afford a PET scan for amyloid imaging. And so the thought of this might be a possibility at the very least of kind of capturing things at a kind of a society or population level. But this is something, I think this is also the reason we're very excited to be working with the YCAP project in New York, because those are individuals with a very broad SES, individuals of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, English and Spanish speakers. It's going to be kind of a great opportunity for us to sort out really what are the limits of this technology and how far can we push it.
Yeah, that's a primary Latinx population. Has been for years. That's great, John. Thank you.
Hey, John, I have a question. So are you suggesting speech problems is an early sign, or just one of the signs that you have a better manage it, or have a hands-on or measure? Or
it's most likely one of many. And again, I think it's the thought that as our technology gets better, that we have the opportunity as our sensors get better, that we'll be able to detect more and more things. Again, we're kind of shifting towards speech just because it's easy. There's a good scientific foundation of
easy to measure. So that's what so easy. So you're not suggesting speech center, for example, in the brain is more vulnerable than the other cortical regions.
Correct. Yes. I'm sorry. Yep. Sorry if I kind of led you astray on that. Yes. It's thought that this is something that's easy for us to tap into at a kind of a practical, real world level. Yeah. Not necessarily that speech is going to be kind of the primary marker of it. It's just, here's a way for us to be able to identify those individuals, detect them, and then kind of push them onto their physicians for further care.
Great.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Hey, I want to know what devices you're using and what sensors you have on a regular basis, just out of curiosity.
Sure. So right now for IRB reasons, we're actually just using Microsoft Teams because again, we know that it's HIPAA compliant. It has all these good security features, but the hope is to be able to kind of push that into smartphones or tablets very, very soon. And for that, we're going to really kind of talk to our industry partners and say, whatever you guys use is the industry kind of the like the military grade encryption. That's what eventually we're going to have to move to. But for all these things, yeah. And again, even I don't get a cut from them, but I encourage people to go out and get an Apple Watch because the technology is amazing. And eventually the hope is to be able to get it at that level. But maybe after they send us a bunch of free samples, I'll share them with this group because you guys are all in on the.
Please let us know.
We're all in on the ground floor. So,
are there other questions? Well, I have another question, John, and that is you mentioned extending this approach to other populations. And I'm wondering whether that includes not just neurologically impaired populations, but also individuals where neurocognitive function is impaired by stress or by diet, things that, again, are related to sort of normal or early types of changes that might occur in our students, for example. Have you tried doing that? Is there any work in that area?
So we have not yet. Again, we're still kind of figuring out some of these baby steps too. But certainly in terms of things like psychological or psychiatric disorders, this idea is being done by other labs as well. And even if they're not necessarily looking at the same speech markers as us, they have the same general premise of using these digital biomarkers, whether that's through Facebook or other types of posting or other types of social media. So this idea I think would be very, very applicable on that. The one nice thing about stress, and this is a little bit silly, is that people are comfortable talking about it though. So speech is not usually hidden. If you ask a person if they're stressed, they'll probably say, yes, I am. I think spots where it could potentially be valuable are situations where people might be willing to minimize. So things like pilots are one, or air traffic controllers, or things that we've worked on for other things. So this is way off what we're talking about today, but identifying people that are in kind of high leverage situations. Can we identify when their performance starts to suffer or starts to deteriorate? So again, an air traffic controller who's doing an 8-hour shift, can we tell when they're starting to make more mistakes? Or a long haul trucker, can we actually do the same sort of thing? I suspect we probably could with a little bit of tweaking down the line. Oh, I'm sorry.
Residents and medical students. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. And they're kind of population. Hey, I just want to say, aside from the fact that we have an amazing executive committee at CBHI, and they read every single grant proposal that came in, and they were very thorough and very selective. In addition to how great CBHI is for funding really cutting edge, interesting research like this, I want to point out that the Brain Health Research Institute matched dollar for dollar every dollar we gave. And it's clearly a great investment. For a really interesting collaboration, you and someone from UH and someone from IBM, these are not the kinds of collaborations we see every day. So if you have any interesting anecdotes or any advice about how to get unusual cross-disciplinary collaborations to work. We'd love to hear it.
Well, thanks, Elaine. Thanks for mentioning that, actually, because, of course, you guys know research knows no boundaries. And the most exciting sorts of things we can discover and the impact we can have on public health really requires all of us to work across borders. And we're very happy to have CVHI as a partner. I hope that somebody does take up John in his offer to move forward with more collaborative projects related to ADRC and others. We're here to spur that collaboration on. John's a great example of that. So thank you, Elaine. Are there any other questions? I think we're about at the end of our time here. And if you all are like me, you probably have a whole bunch of other Zoom meetings scheduled for today. So I think we'll thank John one more time with a round of virtual applause. Thank you, John.